Welcome back to my channel Junior Doctors, where concepts made crystal clear. In this video, we are going to focus on an important topic, that is hypoxia. Now, what do I mean by hypoxia? Hypoxia is nothing but an inadequate supply of oxygen to the tissue. Broadly speaking, hypoxia are of four kinds. Number one is hypoxemic hypoxia. Number two is anemic hypoxia. Number 3 is histotoxic hypoxia, and number 4 is ischemic hypoxia. I have shown you all four types of hypoxia. So before going in detailed explanation of all these four kinds of hypoxia, we are going to focus on an important classification based on symptoms of hypoxia. We have divided it into two parts, that is early sign and symptoms and the late sign and symptoms. Early signs and symptoms includes first symptom, that is restlessness. Number 2 is anxiety. Third symptom is tachypnea. And the fourth and the last one is tachycardia. So the mnemonic to remember the early sign and symptoms is RAT. R-A-T-T, RAT. Before going into the late sign and symptoms, I want to underline two important terms, that is hyperventilation and hyperpnea. What do I mean by hyperventilation? Hyperventilation means an increased ventilation and perfusion. Now, up to which extent? It is up to the extent where it changes the blood chemistry. The important other term is hyperpnea. What do I mean by hyperpnea? Hyperpnea is nothing but increased respiratory rate and respiratory depth. There is no change in blood chemistry. Now let us focus on late sign and symptoms of hypoxia. Late sign and symptoms includes bradycardia, extreme restlessness, dyspnea, and cyanosis. So the mnemonic for late sign and symptoms of hypoxia is bad C. Bad C. Okay, so let's focus on first variety of hypoxia, that is hypoxemic hypoxia. So what are the causes of hypoxemic hypoxia? Broadly speaking, there are three main causes of hypoxemic hypoxia. Number one is changes in ventilation perfusion ratio. Number two is pulmonary diseases. Number three and important is high altitude. So let's start discussing all the causes in detail. So focusing on the first cause, that is high altitude. As we all know that the atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeter of mercury. Now, out of this 760 millimeter of mercury, about 21% is the partial pressure of oxygen, which is roughly about 160 millimeter of mercury. And we have discussed in our previous video that the partial pressure of oxygen inside the lung is about 104 millimeter of mercury. And according to the rule of diffusion, as the partial pressure of oxygen inside the lung is less, whereas the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is more, so air will diffuse inside the lung. But let's assume that we are going higher level, that is we are moving towards the high altitude. Let's suppose we are climbing a high mountain. What happens there? The partial pressure of oxygen gradually starts decreasing, and let's suppose it reaches up to 110 or 120 millimeter of mercury. What happens here? There occurs a drastic difference between the partial pressure of oxygen inside the lung as well as inside the atmosphere. So as the pressure here decreases, the movement of the oxygen inside the lung also starts decreasing. We can see the difference, but here the difference is very less, so diffusion does not take place and the amount of oxygen to the alveoli decreases, and consecutively the exchange of gases from the alveoli to the capillary also decreases, which causes hypoxemia, that is decreased oxygen availability in the blood, and the whole condition entirely known as hypoxemic hypoxia. Second reason, that is pulmonary disease. Now let's take few examples of pulmonary diseases and what happens inside that. So the first example in the pulmonary disease is bronchitis. Now what happens in the bronchitis? In bronchitis there occurs excessive accumulation of mucus inside the alveoli. Increased mucus. What happens next? The amount of oxygen coming from the atmosphere is same, but due to the mucus production, the oxygen reaching to the alveoli decreases. So oxygen decreases, ultimately exchange becomes affected and leading to hypoxia. Second example, which is an important example of asthma. What happens in asthma? See, in asthma there occurs inflammation, and due to the inflammation there occurs bronchoconstriction. So the area inside the bronchi decreases. As the area decreases, pressure increases and the resistance also increases. So, and we have discussed this in our earlier video also, that exchange of gases is inversely proportional to the resistance. Means what? When the resistance increases, the exchange of gas decreases, right? So there is decreased availability of oxygen to the alveoli, leading to hypoxemic hypoxia. Third important example is emphysema. Now what happens in emphysema? We have discussed this disease in our lecture of surface area. So in emphysema, these elastase fibers gets dissolved off. Elastase gets.
फोकस कर लो भाई चालू करो
emphysema मध्ये चालू करो.
करो हाँ एम्फाइसीमा करो चालू करो
मैं ओपन करूंगा.
ये भाई आओ भाई करो
ते करते तो चालू. Oh. So third important example is of emphysema, and we have discussed this disease in our lecture of surface area. So what happens in emphysema? In emphysema, these elastase fibers gets destroyed off. Elastase destroyed, leading to decreased surface area. Mind well, in emphysema there is no changes in the availability of oxygen, but there is a problem inside the alveoli for exchange of gases. So as the surface area decreases, amount of oxygen which is required for the gaseous exchange also decreases, leading to hypoxia. Fourth and the last example in the pulmonary disease is stabbing. Let's suppose someone has stabbed your lungs. What happens here? The pressure inside the pleura starts equilibrating itself to the pressure in the atmosphere. So in return, what happens? Lungs start collapsing. Lungs start moving inside. Ultimately, alveoli starts collapsing. And as soon as the alveoli starts collapsing, the oxygen which is moving inside will get resistance, and ultimately it leads to hypoxemia, that is inadequate availability of oxygen to the blood and ultimately inavailability of oxygen to the tissue, which leads to hypoxemic hypoxia. Now, what is the treatment for hypoxemic hypoxia? It is very simple, right? If you supply an adequate amount of oxygen to the patient, the lung starts expanding, there starts equilibrium in the oxygen supply as well as the demand of the oxygen by the body, and we can make the patient very happy. So another type of hypoxia, that is ischemic hypoxia. Now what happens in ischemic hypoxia? So this is an artery and this is a vein. Let's suppose due to some reason there occurs a formation of thrombus here, or some emboli comes and obstructs the pathway. What happens? The passage of RBC gets decreased, and due to the obstruction there occurs a narrowing of the pathway and decreased amount of RBC moving through this space, and the blood flowing through this space decreases. Ultimately it will decrease the oxygen containing RBC in the vicinity. The oxygen containing RBC decreases, so the exchange of gases, that is transfer of oxygen from the blood to the tissue, also decreases, which leads to ischemic. Now why we tell it as ischemic, that is decreased availability of blood, and oxygen is also inadequate, so this is known as ischemic hypoxia. So for ischemic hypoxia there are two conditions. Number one is thrombosis or embolism inside the vicinity, and the second example is congestive cardiac failure. Now what happens in congestive cardiac failure? The left ventricle, the muscles of the left ventricles becomes weak and they are not able to pump the blood properly. So there occurs accumulation of blood inside the left ventricle. They will not be able to move the blood to whole system. So stagnation of blood will lead to decreased oxygen supply to the whole system, and which will lead to decreased blood flow, that is ischemia, and due to ischemia, inadequate availability of O2 leading to ischemic hypoxia. Now this ischemic hypoxia is also known as stagnant hypoxia. Why? The reason is there is accumulation of blood in left ventricle and they gets accumulated here and will not be get pumped out. So there is a stagnation of blood in the left ventricle. Similar thing happens here also. There is a stagnation of blood due to thrombosis or embolism. That is the reason this hypoxia is also known as stagnant hypoxia. The third and an important variety is anemic hypoxia. So as we all know that in the bones we have pluripotent stem cells which will divide into lymphoid stem cells and myeloid stem cells, and they will form various kinds of blood cells, that is RBC, WBC, platelets and so on. So what happens in anemic hypoxia? So let's recall the classification of anemia. There are various types of anemia, right? Let's suppose aplastic anemia or hemolytic anemia. Another variety is due to some kind of deficiency, that is B12 deficiency anemia or iron deficiency anemia. So you might be questioning that why I am focusing on anemia here. So what happens here? Before going in detail, let's take some mathematical equations here. So in one RBC there are about 250 million Hb molecules. And we know that one Hb molecule have capacity to carry 4 oxygen molecules. So ultimately, one RBC will carry about 1 billion oxygen molecule. Now think about it. If one RBC takes 1 billion oxygen molecule, so in anemia what happens? In anemia there is decreased capacity of a molecule to take RBC molecule to take oxygen to the tissue, which will ultimately lead to hypoxemia, and this hypoxemia will lead to hypoxia, and the main cause is nothing but anemia. So we named it as anemic hypoxia. Next comes an important kind of hypoxia, that is histotoxic hypoxia. So in every cell we have the powerhouse of cell, that is mitochondria. So here we have mitochondria. In mitochondria there occurs an important process, that is cytochrome oxidase pathway, which will release an electron and accepts the oxygen molecule. But let's take an example of toxicity which is caused by an cyanide. So let's suppose this is cyanide that comes in. It will inhibit this cytochrome oxidase pathway and will not allow the acceptance of oxygen, which will result in decreased production of ATP. So let's suppose if here the ATP production decreases, which will also affect this cell, here also ATP production decreases, here also ATP production decreases, so there will be less oxygen transport to the tissue, and which will lead to hypoxia. So this is a kind of hypoxia in which the hypoxia is caused by cyanide poisoning, that is histotoxic hypoxia. And next comes a last condition, that is tardivecynosis. What happens here? Here, this is a kind of birth defect wherein the foramen oval remains open. So the blood, which is oxygenated in nature, from left ventricle will move towards the right side of heart, and which will be passed to the right atrium and the further circulation. Similar thing happens, that is non-oxygenated blood can also move towards left ventricle, and it may proceed to the systemic circulation. But as this occurs opposite to the normal functioning, which will result in the hypertrophy of both the ventricular wall, that is hypertrophy also occurs in the left ventricular wall also as well as on the right ventricular wall. Now what happens here? Let's suppose if the partial pressure of oxygen here is about 100 millimeter of mercury, here the non-oxygenated blood will also get mixed up, and let's suppose it reaches up to the limit, that is 80 mmHg, and further when it moves to the circulation the partial pressure of oxygen is decreased, which will result in hypoxemic hypoxia. Another important condition, that is carbon monoxide poisoning. What happens in carbon monoxide poisoning? We have discussed this thing also in our previous video, that the carbon dioxide accepting capacity is more than that of the oxygen. So during carbon monoxide poisoning there occurs 200 times more affinity in hemoglobin. So this will also lead in hypoxemic hypoxia. Now what will be the treatment for this hypoxia? So as we have discussed, that first treatment is O2 supply. but this is not for all kind of hypoxia. Next is for the thrombosis or embolus, what we can do, we can use drugs such as warfarin. This is nothing but a thrombolysing therapy. Next is digoxin, which is an important drug for congestive cardiac failure. It will stimulate the heart muscle in a particular fashion so that the stasis will not occur and the blood supply will be significantly normalized after digoxin therapy. So in this video we have discussed about various types of hypoxia, various conditions in that hypoxia, certain kind of pathogenesis and physiological features of all kind of hypoxia, and ultimately we discuss about treatment. Hope you understood this concept very well. We will meet in our next video. Till then, enjoy learning. Bye bye.